Good evening. My name is Alan Price. I have the joy and privilege and honor of being the director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you, whether you're here in person or whether you're watching online. Welcome. To open, I humbly begin with a land acknowledgement to recognize that the land on which we stand or sit was once stewarded by indigenous peoples. This is an institution that preserves history, makes history accessible, and challenges all Americans to engage in the civic opportunity and struggle of helping the nation grow ever closer to its noblest ideals as expressed in its founding. And in accordance with that mission, I invite all of us to learn more about and learn more from our nation's history, including indigenous history, and contemplate how to honor and steward the land that each of us inhabits. As many of you know, there is an extraordinary group of volunteers and docents who serve as public-facing ambassadors for our mission, and I want to express my deep gratitude to all of them for their dedication and service. And I want to extend a special thank you to Nancy Dolan. Nancy has greeted our visitors for the past 15 years. And Nancy, I know you're watching us online. Thank you so much. And if any of you wish to be an ambassador for this historic experience, please reach out to a member of our education team. Again, Nancy, terrific. We have with us this evening a special delegation from Kazakhstan. They represent their country's first presidential library, and we are honored to have them with us this evening. This evening's program is part of the Kennedy Library Forum series, and I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, as well as the Mass Cultural Council and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. We're so pleased to welcome many of you who are library members this evening and New Frontier Network members, and we thank you all for your support. Earlier this year, in accordance with presidential directives and in an effort to maximize transparency, all records previously withheld for classification in the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection were released. How grateful we are to have this opportunity to discuss these files and their context this evening. And I'm now honored to properly introduce Fred Logevall, a great friend of the library. He is the Lawrence D. Belfer Professor of History and International Affairs at Harvard, and the author or editor of 11 books, including most recently the first of 3 volumes on JFK. The first volume, JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956, won the Elizabeth Longford Prize and was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year and is now being developed by Netflix into a dramatic series modeled in part on The Crown. I will personally say, I think it is a tremendous book, providing not only an amazing history of the Kennedys, but an amazing history of the times in which they lived, including an insider's view on the origins of World War II. And Fred's book, Embers of War, The Fall of an Empire and the Making of America's Vietnam, won the Pulitzer Prize for History and the Francis Parkman Prize from the Society of American Historians, among other awards. At Harvard, he is on the faculty in the Kennedy School and the History Department. Please join me in welcoming our special guest. Well, as much as I want to dive into the assassination, I just want to back up and say, so what is the status of Volume 2 on the JFK history?
I knew that was coming. So the second volume, I'm happy to say, is completed. It has been submitted. This was going to be a 2-volume work, and then something happened. And now, in fact, we're actually going to do 9 volumes. No, but there will be a third. And so where it stands, Alan, is that the second volume, as I say, now submitted to my publisher, takes the story to the end of Inauguration Day, 1961, snowy day in Washington. John F. Kennedy has become the 35th president, and it ends that night. And then the third volume will cover the presidency and something that we'll talk about a little bit tonight, which is the assassination.
Yes. So these recent releases, ordered by President Trump, there have been other executive orders before promising that they would be released soon, but it's generated a tremendous sense of anticipation, especially for the possibility that they would shed some new light on the assassination. Did they do so?
I don't think so.
Okay, you can go home now. No.
It's really nice to see all of you. Let me say a little bit about this, because I do think that the context here matters. What happened was that in the early 1990s, Alan knows this story, in the early 90s, the federal government mandated that all of the records relating to President Kennedy's assassination would be housed in a single entity, a single collection in the National Archives, and that they would be released, made public, by 2017. There's a caveat, which is that materials could be exempted from this if they pertain to national security or there was personal information in those documents. But the result was we got a lot of materials. I think at latest count, we're past 5 million pages in the National Archives. And then, as you point out, subsequent to 2017, we've had more releases, culminating, of course, this year in the executive order from President Trump that saw the latest tranche in really March and April. I don't think, in terms of helping us understand what happened on that terrible day, November 22nd, 1963, these new releases help us very much. They're interesting for other reasons, which maybe you and I can get into, but not so much on the assassination.
So it doesn't tell us a different answer to the question, who shot JFK?
I don't think so.
So let's get into what it does tell us. What is some of the significance you have learned?
I think where it's most interesting, Alan, is on the question of, or pertaining to national security in the early 1960s in the Kennedy administration, especially with respect to covert action. And I think it tells us a great deal, or at least a significant amount, that I didn't understand before about the nature of that action. Mm-hmm. We should note, by the way, folks, that a lot of these documents, in fact, most of them, were available before in redacted form. What's new about them is that they're unredacted. But with respect to the assassination, to come back to that for a minute, I don't think it yields a great deal of new information. I'm keeping an open mind in terms of what happened. Maybe let's start there. I'm keeping an open mind. I haven't written this part of the story. I tell my students, you've got to be prepared to be surprised when you're a historian. When you're writing your papers in my class, or when I, as a historian or a biographer, am doing my work, we constantly have to be prepared to let the evidence take us where it wants to go. And I think that's the approach that I will take to the matter of the president's assassination. For the moment, I will say that I have not seen evidence that contradicts the prevailing view or that argues against the notion that Lee Harvey Oswald committed the murder. We've had many hundreds of books suggesting that, in fact, others were responsible for this. To date, I have not been persuaded by that evidence. Meanwhile, the evidence suggesting that Oswald committed the murder is quite powerful. Oswald bought the rifle that was used to kill President Kennedy. That rifle was discovered on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository with his palm prints and his fingerprints. 3 shell casings on the floor. Oswald was the only employee, to my knowledge, who fled the scene. And finally, later that day, when approached by a policeman, Lee Harvey Oswald shot Officer Tippit. Now, I should emphasize, this does not rule out the possibility of a conspiracy, in my mind. And this is, again, where I want to keep my mind, I want to keep an open mind about this. If we argue, for the sake of argument here, that Oswald is the gunman and the only gunman, but he had encouragement. He was perhaps prodded. It was suggested that maybe he should do this, or at least somebody encouraged him to do it. That's by definition a conspiracy. Mm-hmm. It seems hard to me to believe that it's a vast conspiracy because of what would be required to keep such a conspiracy secret for so many decades. But a smaller one, I'm at least holding out the possibility that it's possible.
I am curious. You've been at these records for a long time. Many members of our audience may know a lot of this story, but I'll just say for your students or for younger members of our audience here or online, can you say what was the Warren Commission? What other findings did they have? Why were these findings controversial?
So the Warren Commission was the official investigation of President Kennedy's death. It was created by Lyndon Johnson, his successor, on November 29th, so a week after the assassination. And it's fascinating, by the way, to go back and study how LBJ, in his inimitable way, cajoled the members who served on that committee. There were 7 members, plus a very large staff. And Johnson got, in particular, Richard Russell, one of his mentors in the Senate. He wanted, I think, Russell to be his eyes and ears on the committee, and he finally prevailed upon Russell to do this, even though Russell refused.
Russell was a powerhouse in the Senate.
Powerhouse in the Senate. Johnson got him into the mix. So 7 members. The chair was the Chief Justice, Earl Warren. They worked for about 9 months. They produced a report. They had about 550 witnesses. And they worked very hard with large staffs, produced a report in September of 1964. So what is that? About 9 months, I think they took to produce a report, big volume, supplemented by, I believe, 26 supplementary volumes. Those volumes would contain transcripts and other materials, documents, and so forth. But the main report is hefty enough as it is. What they concluded was that Oswald was the gunman. They concluded that he acted alone. You ask why it was controversial. This is interesting. I think part of it was that the commission made mistakes. For example, the commission did not study the X-rays. This is sort of hard to believe, actually. Didn't study the X-rays or the photos of the president's body. And that's been a source of controversy. Even though they interviewed a great many people or took depositions from a great many people, there were people they did not speak with. I think also maybe there's a sense that the Chief Justice, I need to delve deeper into this, but my sense is that he may have been insufficiently attuned to the fact that there were bound to be lots of suggestions of conspiracies, and that the committee, his commission, the commissioners, needed to really be able to address such concerns in a timely fashion. But the upshot is precisely as you say, Alan, that this was a controversial report from the get-go. I will just say one other thing. Most subsequent in-depth analyses, investigations, have, I think, broadly affirmed the conclusions reached by the Warren Commission, even though it's been controversial all these years.
Well, is there something about this latest release of information that stands out for you as particularly interesting or makes you ask new questions?
Yeah, as I suggested before, I think that what's new for me as a historian of the Cold War is the degree to which we see in this latest release, the degree to which the United States was heavily involved in meddling in elections overseas. We knew this, of course. This is hardly news to Cold War historians. But it's one thing to see a document that has individual countries redacted, blurred out, excised, and now to see that same document with those countries identified. That's big. Maybe even more interesting to me is the degree to which we now see that embassies in the Kennedy period, and not just the Kennedy period, I think this is true of Eisenhower before him, I think it's true of Johnson after him, but the degree to which embassy staff around the world was actually CIA personnel. If you had said to me a few months ago, Fred, at the Paris embassy in 1961 under Jack Kennedy, what percentage of the personnel would you guess were actually intelligence officers? I would have said 10, 15, maybe 20%. In fact, it's close to 50. And there's a remarkable memo, again available before but in redacted form, now unredacted, a remarkable memo by Arthur Schlesinger, great historian, often appeared here at the library, obviously, before his passing, but who also served in the Kennedy White House. And in this memo, he talks about the degree to which, in fact, much more than we knew, the agency was central in these embassy operations. And the other thing that's notable about this is that I think there's concern on the part of civilians in the White House that the agency's power, therefore, which could be to some extent unchecked power, or at least excessive power, is going to be too great as a result to allow proper civilian oversight.
I am curious, in the moment, does that revelation hurt American diplomatic interests going forward?
It's a good question. I suspect many people around the world, and indeed many historians like myself, we had a general sense of this already. I mean, it's hardly news to anybody that the United States in this period, remember, Cold War tensions are great in the Kennedy years. Hardly a surprise, I think, to people either here or elsewhere that the CIA is going to be very much present, and that you're going to have the meddling in elections that goes on. I just think it's still important at the margins. I think it'll affect some analyses. And if I may, one other thing that I think is interesting in the documents is the degree to which at various foreign embassies, the documents reveal how, for example, Cuban diplomats are in fact, a number of them working for the United States. They are double agents. So the degree to which the United States has penetrated other diplomatic services is pretty interesting.
Indeed. And do they tell us anything about, our national security concerns of that time period? Anything we didn't know before?
Well, I think what they underscore is the degree to which the Cold War is a zero-sum game. A gain by the Soviet Union is a corresponding loss for the United States, hence zero sum. That, I think, is brought home in these documents for me. The degree to which the Cold War is permeating, the entirety of the U.S. foreign policy priorities, of the foreign policy program of the Kennedy administration, that comes through. I think the degree to which Cuba, again, we knew this, but it underscores the degree to which, the materials underscore the degree to which Cuba is a central preoccupation of this administration before the Bay of Pigs This is the failed invasion many of you know about early in the Kennedy administration. He inherits this from Eisenhower in large part, but he carries it through. It's a disaster. But both before the Bay of Pigs and afterwards, I think what we see in these documents is the degree to which Cuba is a frontline concern of this administration.
Now, these documents are released before you've finished Volume 3. But does it change other historians' works, or does it challenge conclusions that other folks may have read before?
It's a very good question, Alan. I don't know if you have your own sense of this. At least, as I put it earlier, at least at the margins, and maybe more than at the margins, that it will underscore how heavy the covert action program was of the United States, to a greater degree than perhaps we understood. That I can imagine will get greater attention from Cold War historians and from others. And you know, in terms of my own project, I don't think there's any question that I will make use of this material in writing Volume 3. We're getting more information. To give you one example, we're getting more information about US policy toward Vietnam, which is something I've written about before. But I'll be able to make use of this material to better understand US concerns about developments in Southeast Asia and in Vietnam, the move ultimately to support a coup against the South Vietnamese leader, Ngo Dinh Diem. That coup, as I think many of you know, happened on November 1st, 1963, just 3 weeks before Kennedy's own assassination. Hugely important development on the road to an American war in Vietnam. These materials, I suspect, again, I haven't written this part of the story, but these materials will be helpful to me as a biographer, as a historian, and certainly also the work of other historians.
So a lot of these forces come together and support conspiracy theories. Many Americans are still convinced that we don't know the truth of how this happened or why this happened. So why do you think there are so many persistent conspiracy theories regarding this assassination?
It's a great question. We need to discuss this. I guess I would put it first in general terms, and then let me offer some specific terms. In general terms, Alan, I think there's something comforting about conspiracies. What do I mean? Well, I think they help us make sense of what otherwise can seem inexplicable. How can it be that a lone individual, in this case, a somewhat lost young man, he's just turned 24, he's got grievances, he's upset about this, that, or the other thing, he's unstable. How can it be that the actions of this guy could change our world? It can't be. Much more, I think, comforting for people then to suspect there has to be a cabal. To put it differently, I think we have a tendency as human beings, all of us, myself included, to believe that great events must have great causes. Huge events must have huge causes. And I think that's in part what's going on here. And when you think about the contingencies on that day, it's hard to get your head around. For example, if the Secret Service had said, Mr. President, you really need to have the bubble top up, which they could have said, you know? Or if a coworker of Oswald had come to the 6th floor just as he's preparing to do the deed, just as the car is coming down Elm Street out in front. So we try to get our heads around this, and I think it's hard. That's my general answer, and I'd be keen to know if you have a thought yourself. My specific answer as to why this particular event has spawned so much conspiracy theorizing, the specifics, I think, would be, in no particular order, the fact that Oswald himself was killed 2 days later What's that about? How did that happen? That can't be. The person who murdered the president can just be shot like this by Jack Ruby? I think people struggle with this. I think it's, again, in no particular order. Oswald's actions in the weeks prior, and we haven't talked about this yet. We should talk a little bit about this. We can come back to it, but his travels, maybe in particular the fact that he was in Mexico City in late September, early October for 5-6 days. And he met there with Cuban officials, Soviet officials. That, I think, matters. I think the mistakes by the Warren Commission that I referred to earlier has also had a tendency to perhaps feed the conspiracy theorizing. And maybe I'd mention one other point, which is something I have to try to grapple with in the third volume of this book. A sense on the part of a great many Americans that something changed on November 22nd, 1963, that America was not the same on the 23rd of November as it had been on the 21st of November. I think that's, again, maybe it connects to my first point, that there's a consoling, a soothing aspect to conspiracies, because they help us make sense of something that otherwise seems inexplicable. I don't know. Does that?
A great event must have had greater forces behind it.
I mean, what do you think?
Well, it certainly does not only fuel the imagination in the public. It's amazing how many pop culture references there are. Entire science fiction series have been developed about this, movie references. I haven't seen this many pop culture references to a prior president other than Nixon gets a lot in conspiracy things, and Lincoln gets a lot in conspiracy press.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. They are, they're larger than life figures, absolutely. Even as compared to other American presidents, who are by definition, especially in the modern period, larger than life figures. But these three, and maybe one or two others, are in a kind of special category. I think in Kennedy's case, he's on some level frozen in our minds, isn't he?
Yes.
Age 46, seemingly in the prime of life. There he is in the back of that limousine with that 1,000-watt smile of his. And it was captured on film, a film that sort of plays endlessly in our minds. And by the way, I would add that to a list of specific reasons why the conspiracy theorizing has been so heavy for this.
We've watched it.
Because it was filmed.
Yes.
So Kennedy, and he had that cool charisma. We can talk about the glamour of his White House. We can talk about his beautiful family. All those things, I think, make him, as you say, this gives him this salience in our popular culture. But I think there's more to it, Ellen, which again I'm trying to sort out in my mind. It seems to me that as I said before, that something important happened in the minds of a lot of Americans on that day. And by the way, not just Americans. What do we make of the fact, and there's ample proof of this, that around the world, tens of millions of people wept when they got the word that President Kennedy has been shot and killed? What do we make of that? It tells me that the message that resonated with Americans, which I think was an uplifting message, I should say, by the way, as you and I both know, John F. Kennedy had flaws.
He's not a perfect person.
He had flaws. It only makes him more interesting. But I do think that the message that he delivered, and in a sense lived, which resonated with Americans,
And those words resonate today.
And they resonate today. But they also worked with people overseas. This idea that you give back. You give something to something greater than yourself. Those things that unite Americans are more important than those things that divide Americans. That was a message that he preached. His belief in American democracy, that America's best days were ahead. I think that is also part of the answer to this. You know, Walter Lippmann, the great journalist, and I think about this quite a lot, Lippmann said something like this: the job of an American president is to touch the chords of memory that unite a people. And there's power in that. A less, I don't know, poetic way of saying it is that a president can leave, when he leaves office, or she leaves office, can leave the country in a better place or a worse place. I think John F. Kennedy left it in a better place. But that inspirational message, I think, and the other things we talked about, the glamour, the handsome first couple, his charisma, his speech making, the press conferences, the seriousness with which he took his office. I think that matters too, which we haven't talked about. All of that comes together, it seems to me, to give Kennedy a special place.
And in case members of the audience don't know, of course his speeches are terrific, but if you can watch the press conferences, I think that is Kennedy at his unscripted, funniest and best.
Yeah. Well, and let me say one thing I should have said at the outset. Kicking myself over here for neglecting to say this, Alan. As I'm working on these volumes, 2 done, 3rd still to come, this facility, Alan, I mean, this is Mecca for me and for anybody who's working on the Kennedy years. But the materials that we have available in the reading room, the archivists, it is just an absolute goldmine. And so to get a chance to sit here tonight and talk about this means a great deal, but it also connects to what we're saying here, that seeing and reading the transcripts of his speeches, and of course, Ted Sorensen, who we haven't mentioned, deserves also great credit for his role in the speech making. But reading that in the reading room and going through the drafts, seeing the inaugural address, which I've just written about, 1,360 words, not a word wasted. You can see the successive drafts in the reading room, and it's magnificent.
With edits right up to the last minute.
Yeah. With edits, actually, in Kennedy's case, on the stage. Quite often, you can compare the text that's in front of him with what was actually delivered, and you can see that he's making some changes on the fly. He was not, early in his political career, a particularly effective speaker, but he worked very hard at it, and by the end had become much, much better.
Well, as many of you know who've been through our exhibit, we put out on display 1 C- that Kennedy received in public speaking. Your book refers to a collegiate C he gets in public speaking.
Well, and I'll just interrupt and say, you can find this with a quick Google search. An archivist in the Harvard libraries, I want to say 7 or 8 years ago, found a recording of the class 1937, think about this, when young Jack Kennedy is in a speech class, and there he is. We hear the distinctive voice, but with a more pronounced Boston accent than he had later, giving a speech in this class for which I'm pretty sure he got a C. But you can listen to it. It's unbelievable.
I'm told he's in good company because I recently learned that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. got a C+ in his public speaking class. So 2 of the great speakers of that generation.
Which is not an argument for getting C+, those of you who are.
But if you did receive one,
That's
do
right.
not underestimate your potential. And I should also put in a plug that our collection of 20 million paper documents is not only accessible by historians and scholarly researchers. These are the people's papers. If you would like to see them, make an appointment. You can do it online and come in and hold, for example, original constituent mail, letters to the president from 1960, 61, 62, 63, and go through it and see for yourself where America stood on usually both sides of any issue, and see what the president was trying to weigh as he was trying to unite a nation that was clearly divided on everything from civil rights to the Cold War response.
Absolutely. I want to say one other thing, Alan, because I think I dropped the thread earlier in response to one of your questions, which is it possible that there are documents out there that will teach us a lot? Is there more that I would like to see? And the answer to that question is yes. Some of this might be in foreign archives, which makes it maybe more problematic. Some of this material might be in Russian archives, for example, Mexican archives, Cuban archives. But I think it would be really great and important and fascinating if we could learn more about the nature of Oswald's conversations in Mexico City. What was said there? By whom? And what was the response? Or after he left and went back to the United States, what was said, for example, by Mexican officials when they considered his visit? It would be interesting to know from the CIA if, as has been suggested, the CIA, in a sense, dropped the thread, failed to inform the FBI in the lead up to the assassination of what it knew about this unstable character named Lee Harvey Oswald. You know, there are documents of that kind that would be really great to get. Or the degree to which the CIA and the mob might be involved in anti-Castro activities. Could we learn more about those actions? The Cuban connection here is quite interesting. So even if I'm suggesting that we haven't learned in this latest release anything, at least for me, that dramatically changes my sense of what occurred on the 22nd of November, I think there is that possibility. I'll say one other thing, which is we may never, Alan, we may never get
Satisfactory
answers that will satisfy everybody. And that's hard for us to accept as human beings, but it may also be the truth.
I am also encouraged by the possibility that history reveals itself over time sometimes. And though it may not happen in our lifetime, I hope the truth will come out at some point.
Yeah, I agree.
It's not out already.
It's true, and you know, we have an obligation as historians, I think, as I say to my students, you gotta weigh the evidence carefully. You gotta let the evidence take you where it wants to go. You gotta be prepared to change your mind. I love John Maynard Keynes' quote. I think you all know it. When the facts change, I change my mind. What do? And that's something I tell my students. But the point I'm making is just to affirm what you just said. Over time, in the fullness of time, as we get more and more material, both primary sources and secondary sources, we develop a better understanding of what occurred.
Now, most people won't read all these original documents. You're aspiring to. You have students who aspire to. It strikes me that that puts a special responsibility or burden on historians. What do you tell your students is your responsibility? How do you carry this weight?
It's a really good point. And we do have a great responsibility. And we're fallible. We'll make mistakes. We won't get everything right. But we do the best we can. And it's actually incumbent upon my students. They're not absolved from this. And we haven't talked tonight about the implications of AI for some of the work we do. But I think I, as their instructor and as a biographer and a historian, I have to do what I can with the materials I have available, but so do the students. And you're absolutely right. Most Americans won't undertake that kind of an effort. which does put a greater burden on those of us who are, to make sure that we get that story right. The other thing that's happening is, of course, that we're seeing more documentary films, we're seeing dramatic series, we're seeing more podcasts. Obviously, we're always getting journal articles and books, but there's just such a plethora now of genres or means by which to convey historical knowledge. And I'll just say that however it's done, it's critical. History is collective memory. And without a sense of history and a sense of our shared history, which worries me in terms of where we are in the United States today, our shared history.
There's been an erosion of the shared history.
Oh, no
shared
question.
Sense of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we have a task, is the point.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm curious, given that there's certainly no public consensus on events, is there actually a historian consensus on events?
Well, it's been said that history is an argument without end, a wise historian said, and I think that's true. And that's, in a sense, something to be celebrated. I love being a historian, in part because of the fact that, we have ongoing debates. So in that sense, there probably will never be a full consensus, in this case, on what happened on that terrible day. History is about revision, about revising. There will always be revisionist history, and in the best sense of that term. That said, I also think there is, to go to your question, there is a consensus often on, how should I put it? The pieces or the elements that make up the causal hierarchy. Just not the order in that causal hierarchy. In other words, what do you think is the most important reason why, I don't know, the Vietnam War happened? Second, third, fourth. Historians will disagree about the order, but not so much about the elements. And so I think a classic example would be the origins of World War I. Even after 100+ years, historians do not agree on the principal reasons why that war happened. I think broadly they do agree on the elements that make up that explanation. So some will say it was, the myopia of European leaders, of sovereigns, the European sovereigns and their top advisors. In other words, they put it on the level of human agency. Mm-hmm. Other historians will say, no, it's more about alliance systems, it's about the arms race, it's about imperialism. But probably most historians will have these elements somewhere, and it's about where they rank.
Different weightings. But...
Yeah, which I think will also apply to the Kennedy assassination. Or at least the results, what happens after that. What kind of change did it cause, if it caused one, in American society? Kennedy and the Cold War, Kennedy and Vietnam. You'll see differences among historians, but they're probably talking about the same core issues.
What I'd like to do is do a quick survey of our audience on 2 questions before we open up for question and answer.
Oh, this is good.
So there is just enough light for me to see, which is fine. A quick show of hands, how many of you remember exactly where you were on November 22nd, 1963? Which I find very interesting. And I know that...
That's a majority.
Yes.
Large majority.
It's an overwhelming majority. And how many of you are satisfied with the information you have about the assassination? Okay, that's a good number of hands, but it is no longer the majority, which is fascinating. And we will have a short time for question and answer, and we do have microphones in the aisles that one could go to. And so I would just ask, because it's a short time, if we could get to the question, that would be most helpful. Please come to the microphones. Yes, sir.
Okay, what is your theory on why Jack Ruby killed Oswald?
The question is about Jack Ruby and what is my theory on why he killed Oswald. The simplest explanation, I think, is the best one. And again, I emphasize that I'm still in the early phases of this. I have not exhaustively researched this issue yet. My sense is that Jack Ruby killed Oswald because he was angry about what happened. I think Jack Ruby thought he would be seen as a hero. I'm going to take down the guy who killed our president. You know, I guess you could say that in a way, Jack Ruby looked straight from central casting in terms of having a potential mob connection. And so there's been a lot of speculation about Ruby's potential ties. I think the explanation, at least as far as I can see, is a simpler one. He had that motive, he had the means, and it proved, of course, astonishingly easy for him to carry it out.
Right, to have that opportunity. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much for your time. Two quick questions. The first one being, obviously Lee Harvey Oswald was shot before he went to trial. Are there any records as to what the prosecution's case would have included if it did go to trial?
Well, I think what would have been the heart of the prosecution's case, I'm only speculating, but the heart of the prosecution's case would have been what I said earlier.
Means, motive, opportunity.
Yeah, and the fact that this is his rifle, mail-order rifle, his fingerprints and palm prints are on it, the shell casings are there, he flees, he shoots Officer Tibbet. I have to believe that's the core of the prosecution's case. Presumably, they then will try to show his growing anger, his alienation from the United States. He's already become alienated from the Soviet Union. But I think the heart of it will be the physical evidence, I would have to think.
Yeah, and a quick follow-up to that. I understand the CIA had followed Lee Harvey Oswald for many years prior to the assassination. Is there any indication, or do you have any feeling as a historian, what motivated the assassination based upon the CIA's records?
Well, it's maybe not so much the CIA's records, but let's say the evidence in total that I've seen to this point would suggest that this young man, and he is a young man, is unstable at this point in his life. He is, he's made already an attempt at General Walker's life, so we know he has the what's the word? Not the capacity, but the willingness to carry out something like this. And I think, perhaps, I'm speculating a little bit here, but he's gotten wind of the fact that the Kennedy brothers, the Kennedy administration, is engaged in actions against Castro's Cuba that might even include assassination. And that, when he finds out that the motorcade is going to go right by his place of work, which is just astonishing, he says, I'm going to do this.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
So I would agree with you on
Closer to the mic.
I would agree with you on one point strongly, that there's a sense that something changed in this when Kennedy was assassinated for the country. But I would say that the reason for that, and the vast majority, are over 50% of the nation in polls still think that there was a conspiracy here. Is that we lost some faith in our government, and I think the reason we lost faith in our government is because the CIA has so assiduously protected
Is
these
there a question
records.
coming?
Well,
Yes, so there is a question. So why do you think the CIA has so assiduously tried to protect these records? And specifically, I'm interested in the Joannides file and the Heath memo, and that they actually brought this guy out of retirement to be the liaison to the House Select Committee on Assassinations when he was the person they were looking for.
Can I pause you there and let him?
I think that the CIA, a very plausible explanation for the CIA's actions. And I would make a broader point, which is that the executive branch of the government often sees it in its interest to keep things secret. And that's a problem. We didn't talk, Alan, about the harm that is done
There's a
to
public
public
impact.
trust
Yeah.
when things are kept secret. And we can acknowledge that some things have to, national security concerns, you have to keep them secret for a time. You can't simply inform the American public in 2011 that you're about to do this to capture Osama bin Laden. That's got to be kept secret. But I think the explanation for the CIA's actions could simply be that it was embarrassed, that it lost the thread on Oswald, should have known in the lead up to Dallas what he was up to, and then had motive, therefore, to cover it up. Well,
It just isn't strong enough.
could be.
Yes, over here.
Could you clarify the so-called magic bullet theory on the assassination? And secondly, are you concerned as an historian for what the current administration seems to be influencing the way our American history is going to be presented for this 250th anniversary?
Thank you.
On the second point, yes, I'm concerned, deeply concerned about, and we don't know, at least I don't know yet, what the extent of that effort will be. It's just really, in some ways, at least has come to light more in the last couple of days, but of course, a tremendous concern. We historians and we, the American people, have to have full access to the truth and to what's happened, based on careful reading, as we've been discussing, of the evidence. With respect to the magic bullet theory, this was developed by Arlen Specter, at the time a young hotshot member of the investigation, and it suggests that, hence the name, a single bullet caused injuries to the president and to John Connolly. And people have said, well, how is that possible? It's just magic. And in fact, again, based on my understanding of things that I have seen, it's a highly plausible, indeed the only plausible explanation for that particular shot by Oswald.
Was there any evidence that Oswald, after his service in the military, because he was known as a marginal shooter, did he practice his craft? Was he actively training? Because that was a long shot in a moving car. You see what Trump was standing still, and the guy missed him trying a headshot. So it seems difficult to believe that a marginal shooter could pull off.
Well, I defer to people who know more about this than I do. I will simply say this, having been myself to the school book depository, and if you've been to Dallas or you're going to Dallas, I recommend that you go. It's actually very well done. It's worth seeing. But what struck me when I was up there, sir, was the degree to which it's closer, at least, than I imagined. The motorcade is actually moving pretty slowly for various reasons. But I don't know the answer to whether he practiced a lot or, there's some dispute about the nature of his marksmanship. Can you maybe tilt it down? Okay, I'll repeat the question. Yeah. When you ask after. Yeah.
He's going to repeat it so the audience can hear it.
Piggybacking on what you said about conspiracy theorists and the what if Jackie had traded places with Jack at the last minute? Would he have still shot them both, or he would have still shot Jackie and missed Jack?
You mean, the question was about Jackie and if they had switched seats, I guess. Well, I don't know, but I have to believe that Oswald had enough time to say, oh, the president is there, and he's going to aim at the president. So,
Yes.
Yes. So, do any of these these non-redacted files change the way that you look at where we're going as a country, like our trajectory? Does that sort of history orient you in a different way, where you look at conspiracy theories that might be emerging now, and just how prolific some of this information that's being withheld may be?
yeah, the question was about whether whether these releases and what I'm seeing in these releases is changing my view of where the country might be going now. I don't think so. I think I knew enough as a historian, been at this now for 3+ decades. I knew enough about what the United States was doing in terms of its Cold War policies, its covert action, its trying to influence other nations' elections, for example. I suppose others, were they to delve into these documents, who didn't have this prior knowledge, I think it could feed a certain cynicism. And I would say we have way too much cynicism in our society as it is. And so that would be a concern, that somebody coming to this stuff fresh could say, look at what this government has done. Never trust, I won't trust them again, or whatever. I just think for me personally, it wouldn't have that effect.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for being here and enlightening us. You haven't said anything about Marina Oswald. She was Russian. After Lee Harvey Oswald was killed, her life was hell.
Yeah.
And I think that may be something that has fed into the conspiracy theory. Well, he was married to a Russian woman, therefore the Russians must have been involved. Do you have any perspective on that?
The question is about Marina Oswald and how we should think about her. And I'm glad you mentioned her, because she's an important part of this. And I think you're right. I think that has certainly fed some suggestions that the Russians must have been somehow behind this. I think it's highly unlikely. Khrushchev, the leader in the Soviet Union, was set upon improving relations with Washington. There are credible reasons, there's credible evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that when Nikita Khrushchev learned that John F. Kennedy had been killed, he wept. He wept. Because he and Kennedy were on the way to improving the superpower relationship. So, but you're right to mention Marina. I'll mention a book by a dear late friend of mine, Priscilla Johnson McMillan, which is a kind of almost joint biography of Marina and Lee. She considers both of them. Highly illuminating for anybody who wants to read about her and her marriage to this troubled Lee.
Thank you. Yes.
So to bring this more towards back to the modern history of what's happening right now, and I have my opinion, my own opinion on this, but I'd like to hear yours. How did releasing this papers really serve the present administration?
Oh, I love this question.
Well,
If you'd repeat the question.
well, the question is how does the release of these documents serve the present administration? The president in 2024, that is to say in the election campaign last year, campaigned on this. He might have been encouraged even then by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but he's also, President Trump is a longtime conspiracy theorist of the First Order. And I think he felt and had campaigned before about the need to release these documents. He was persuaded in his first term, I think by Mike Pompeo, who was the Secretary of State, not to release more on national security grounds. So he's going to do it now. I don't know, Alan, what do you think? How does this, do you have a thought on how it serves or doesn't serve the current administration?
Well, I suspect at a certain level, it's always nice when a president can deliver on a campaign promise. So there is that.
Yep.
And if that also serves to change the conversation away from other topics, sometimes that's expedient as well.
Two pretty good answers. for the second hour, I'll be posing questions to Alan.
So we've got a really short time left. If we could get right to the question, we'll take as many as we can.
Real quick. So when you're writing your perception of the events, studying the material, how do you value the powerful forces at play, like their motives, incentives, the Dulles brothers, to name an example per se, versus the big picture versus the small picture, the evidence, what's in the files, and how do you kind of weigh that story?
It's a good question. The question is about how we weigh various kinds of evidence, powerful individuals versus perhaps other forces. I mean, my answer is the obvious one, which is that it's incumbent upon me as a historian and a biographer to weigh the relative importance of the players and the structural forces with which they operate. Because let's remember, even the most powerful individuals are constrained by powerful forces. We see this all the time. Even Adolf Hitler ultimately was constrained by forces beyond his control, and other dictators too. I've been reading about Robert McNamara recently, Secretary of Defense under both Kennedy and Johnson, probably the most consequential one we've had. And I'm trying to debate with myself, figure out myself, how influential was he? So I don't think there's any secret to this. I hope that's at least the beginning of an answer.
Sure. Yes.
Do you believe that President Kennedy's assassination affected the careers of Robert Kennedy and Edward Kennedy?
Did the assassination of John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, affect the careers of his brothers? Yes, I think that it did. It's hard to determine how it did. You would not have seen Bobby run for the U.S. Senate when he did. He would have bided his time. He would have probably stayed in the administration. I think it's very likely that John F. Kennedy would have won re-election in '64. Teddy, I think, in some ways was the most natural politician. So I think he was destined for public office. But there's no question that Dallas changed
everything.
Thank you both for your time. My question is in regard to the relationships between so many CIA and mafia people. You have George the Warren Shield, who befriended Lee Harvey Oswald. You have Jack Ruby, very heavily tied into the mob. After the assassination, you have Alan Dulles, who becomes part of the Warren Commission. Do you think the tie is with the mafia or the CIA, or is it just in conjunction both?
The question is about the mob and the CIA and maybe the conjunction?
Yeah, are they both intertwined as one, or are they both separate entities working together for one goal, which was unfortunately President Kennedy's assassination?
Yeah, I don't see evidence myself, and again, I want to keep repeating because I'm sure I'm going to get emails about this.
It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but you haven't seen the evidence.
Yep. I have not seen evidence to this point to suggest that kind of working together, or even working separately, to make this terrible thing happen on November 22nd is reality. I know that that's believed. It just seems hard for me to believe for various reasons, which in the interest of time I won't go into. I'll just mention one, which is if the CIA wanted to do this, it's hard for me to see why they would use, of all people, Oswald for this deed. There would have been much better ways for them to do this.
Well, Mackenzie?
Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm a representative for the online community, and so we do have a question about the CIA files and whether there's any concerns about any missing documentation, specifically from the CIA.
Concerns about missing documentation?
Well, in the sense that I think there are still more materials to come out. Yes, there's still missing information. I don't think we have 100% of the materials out, including the CIA. This is why I suggested earlier that I am, for one, still keen to see what else we can learn, even though I'm skeptical that it'll overturn our understanding of what occurred in Dallas. But yes, I think there's more material we could find, including, and I hope to get, including from the CIA.
A last question.
Thank you. I think the two most most often heard references when it comes to conspiracies about John F. Kennedy is about the dad, Joseph, promising the mob that, they wouldn't go really after them. And I don't remember, but I wasn't alive, but I know that as Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy chased after them quite hard. And then the other thing is that his Vice President LBJ wanted to get into the war with Vietnam. And there's that photo right after he's sworn in Jackie's blood-stained pink outfit, and he winks to a man in a dark suit standing against Air Force One.
Well, I'll just say here with respect to, I'll respond to the part about Johnson and Vietnam, because this is something I've written a lot about. I do think there was a difference between the two presidents with respect to Vietnam. The so-called mother of all counterfactuals, what would Kennedy have done in Vietnam, is a legitimate question. I don't agree, however, with the suggestion that Johnson was eager for war in Vietnam, that he wanted to get into the war in Vietnam. I don't think he did. I think he was a committed anti-communist, and I think Lyndon Johnson worried about what would happen to him politically if he did not stand firm in Vietnam. But that's different, very different from the suggestion that he wanted to go into Vietnam and somehow therefore maybe willed this to happen or was responsible for this. No evidence that I can see to that effect.
Well, at a variety of levels, I'd like to thank this amazing audience. Your engagement here at the microphone is great. Your passion for this history is great. Thank you all for coming out tonight in person and online, and thank you, Fred.